different books, in fact. Christine has done a deep dive she's going to tell us about, which sounds fascinating, Christine, and I'm sorry I haven't yet read your book. And Stephen is going to talk about something very interesting for those of us who bandy about diplo jargon. There's a lot to chat about partnership in international relations. But he's written a book about how difficult partnership is and how sometimes what masquerades as partnership is something rather different, if I understand you correctly, and quite legitimately as well as perhaps less legitimately, because perspectives can vary. But why don't we, and I see with alarm that Chris is injured, why don't we start with you? Tell us a bit about your deep dive into Lashkar-e-Taiba.
All right, but what I'm going to first say is, taking up the points that I didn't get a chance to make, don't assume that those religious extremists are Muslim. We're both from the United States, where 1/3 of the voting population explicitly supports white extremism. And that is what is explaining the monstrosity in the White House. And so I share your question, but from a very different optic. I can't tell you what it means to walk through an airport and know that 1 in 4 women that I will encounter randomly actually supports an explicitly white supremacist regime. Never growing up in the United States did I ever expect that I would have a president that would use building a wall as his Reichstag fire to declare a national emergency, right? So I want to be very clear that while I'm going to talk about one particular kind of terrorist group, the terrorist group that is terrorizing my country are actually not Muslims. The data show this overwhelmingly, that they are white supremacists. So I don't want you to think that just because I'm presenting on Lashkar-e-Taiba, that I think it's the end-all be-all. The biggest threat to my country is white supremacy. And not only white supremacy which explicitly targets women. We have men in the United States who so hate women that they go into yoga studios to shoot us. I want you to think about that. You're doing yoga, minding your own business, doing a downward dog, and some nut job brings in an AR-15 and shoots you. That's the state of America today. I felt more afraid in Washington, D.C. the last 3 months than I did walking around in Kabul. With that, and I'm happy to discuss this, because I'm absolutely shameless and I don't care who I offend about this. But having done this, I'm now going to talk about Lashkar-e-Taiba. All right, so let's talk about this book. So this book, like the book on the Pakistan Army, has been literally decades in the making. I've been collecting their written material since 1995. I remember the first time I went into a Lashkar-e-Taiba bookstore. There was this fabulous poster that had all of the world's capitals on fire. And the one thing I love about misogynists, and thank you all misogynists, you know who you are, is that you think we're stupid. So I went up to the fellow and I said, "Are chacha ji, ye cheez kya hota hai? Bahut dilchasp hai. Zara samjha lijiye." And then he gave me everything in the bookshop. So for you who don't know the Hindi Urdu, I basically said, "Oh, uncle," in my dumbest girl voice possible, "this is the most fascinating thing. Can you explain it to me like a child?" And he gave me everything. So I've been collecting this stuff literally since 1995, and it's only since coming to Georgetown that I had the luxury to actually spend the time that it takes to go through this stuff. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is what I call the macabre social capital of the Lashkar-e-Taiba. And so in this book, I kind of do an amuse-bouche of a much larger project that I'm working on, and that is to say that I have 1,000 shaheed biographies, or what we would call terrorist biographies. To make it into my data set, you have to be unique. Not everyone that wants to join Lashkar can make it in. Even McDonald's screens out the most duffers of duffers, and Lashkar-e-Taiba does the same. When my brothers joined the US Army, they didn't have to do anything to go to Iraq, they just had to be alive, and apparently in those days not be gay. So with Lashkar-e-Taiba, it's not so easy. Once you join the organization, this does not mean that you simply get deployed. In fact, Stephen has written a similar thing about 9 out of 10 people who are trained by Lashkar will never be deployed. And in fact, what those 9 out of those 10 people are deployed for is information operations within Pakistan. So whereas Stephen's superb book on Lashkar-e-Taiba focuses upon what they do outside of Pakistan, my book focuses upon the domestic politics of the organization. In some sense, it sort of presages why the LET sets up the MML, which it obviously used to contest elections in the last election. So what I've done in this presentation, what's presented in this book, but which is a part of a larger project that I'm currently doing on battlefield motivation, is I did a 10% random sample of these biographies. And I was specifically trying to develop hypotheses about what motivates these Lashkar fellows to fight. And what I have published previously and what's in the book is that these fellows, they're not undereducated. In fact, they're some of Pakistan's most educated persons relative to the populations from which they draw. And we would expect this, right? Because Lashkar basically doesn't recruit cannon fodder, it recruits special operators. And if you look at the operational security they have to maintain, multiple infiltrations and exfiltrations, we see constant selection effects which would prejudice our sample towards some of the most educated and most competent people. When we do see madrasa education, by the way, it's after they've joined the organization. And so in my book, I never use the word radicalization. Both of my brothers joined the US Army at 16. We would never say the US Army radicalized them, but I assure you they did. My brothers never considered shooting a human being. It was only after they joined the US Army that they considered shooting a human being and indeed learned to do so. Many of the young men that Lashkar-e-Taiba recruits, they're exactly the same. They will join the organization for various mythologies, but it's only once they join that they learn to kill and indeed have a taste for killing, right? So in many ways, I view Lashkar-e-Taiba as a traditional military organization rather than something exotic. Once we say someone has radicalized, we stop viewing them as rational actors, and we view them as something exotic. So in my book, I never use this language. I'm looking for their battlefield motivation. So in this, it's very much in the same line of the studies that looked at Nazi battlefield motivation, the Civil War cadres in the US Civil War, what motivated them to fight. So this is very much in that tradition, not in the radicalization tradition.
Christine, we'll
Yeah.
have to accelerate.
Yeah. But it's important to make that point because I think this radicalization discourse is not helpful. So let me tell you what I did find. Families matter. Much of the countering violent extremism work focuses on the young men of military age. But what I found in looking at these biographies is that not only do families matter, mothers matter in particular. The mothers will be the ones that encourage their sons to go off and fight. And as a sister of soldiers who fought in the Iraq War, some of the things I read I could never imagine ever being said by a mother or a sister. But yet I consistently saw this. A very common refrain was, I want you to go and take a bullet on your chest. I don't want you to come back a Ghazi. I want you to come back a Shaheed, which is to say, I don't want you to come back a veteran. I want you to come back, actually not at all, because they'll never see the body. And one of the reasons, actually there are several reasons for this, is that not only are mothers and sisters almost worshipped in Pakistan, there's no higher social status than being a mother or a sister or a wife of a Shaheed. The other thing is that they truly believe that when their sons or their brothers or their husbands become martyred, they get to intercede on their behalf to go to heaven. So these are truly some of the most horrible mothers, wives, and sisters, and truly some of the laziest, because they want this individual to be killed so that he can bring them to heaven without them doing anything at all. The other thing I noticed is that not only does Lashkar-e-Taiba focus upon the family as a unit rhetorically, they have many publications dedicated to this, they actually behave in many ways like an American gang. If you study the American gangs, and I lived in Chicago and had some familiarity with them, when a young man dies in a gang, it is the gang's foremost interest that they not lose that family. Because after all, they want that mother to continue dedicating more sons to the gang. So what they'll do is that they will pay that family. They will pay the funeral, they'll pay them an honorarium. And the funeral actually becomes a place not only of extolling the slain drug runner's career, it also becomes a place of honoring the family, that you have given such an amazing sacrifice. It also becomes an opportunity to continue recruiting. So I'm not sure how long we're supposed to talk, but I'm going to take the hint that I'm supposed to shut up.
Temporarily.
Temporarily. But what I'd like to leave you with is this idea that when we think about counter-violent extremism programming, I want you to stop thinking singularly of the man of military age, but I want you to think about the family that supports this decision, the family that not only sends one individual to their death, the families that will send repeated men to their death. Because if we're only focusing on the men of military age, and we're not focusing upon the women who are shaping this decision, we are literally missing most of the puzzle. Thank you.
Great. Now, thank you, Christy. Stephen, tell us about your book. I should mention, by the way, that he himself has written about Lashkar-e-Taiba in the past, but he's not talking about that book, which is quite recent, actually, but about his new book. The authors have in common that they teach in universities in Washington, D.C. Washington, and Washington, D.C. has a number of excellent universities, so it's fun to have you both together this evening. Over to you, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's always great to be on panel with Chris. We've been on, I think, a lot of them over the years. And let me also just say, before I talk about my book, that I had the pleasure and the honor of reading Chris's book in advance to Florbet, and it is fantastic. And you said that you spent like many, many years in the making, and that is quite obvious when one reads it, that is a really deep dive. So my first book was about Lashkar-e-Taiba, and that had led me into research that brought me ultimately into the Department of Defense. And I mention that because when I went into DoD, I was planning on writing a book about how terrorist organizations are influenced by their relationships with the states where they develop and operate. And when I came out of the Department of Defense, I had about 80% of my book written, and I realized that I was going to write a different book. So I had a very understanding publisher who's apparently not great at actually getting books to book talks, unfortunately, and ended up writing a book about how, and I wrote this from a US perspective, but I think a lot of the findings are more universal, how the United States works with partner nations in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. These are partners that are absolutely critical to the United States. I would say they are critical in terms of the international community's effort with regard to countering terrorism, but they are also often the most problematic partners as well. And I should note this was informed by my study of Pakistan as an academic and also by working on Pakistan inside the government. So that is one of 6 case studies. The others are Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Mali, Egypt, and Algeria. And my sort of central premise was that many of these partners, as the title of the book says, are simultaneously with and against the United States. They both help and hinder the United States in terms of achieving US counterterrorism objectives. But that working with partners is, to paraphrase Churchill, probably the worst way of going about international counterterrorism, except for every other way of doing it, which is to say that partners are absolutely unavoidable. So then the question became, how does a country get more out of its counterterrorism partners? And here, I need to note that we live in a very, very different time after 9/11 than we did beforehand in terms of the type of cooperation that is sought. For a long time, counterterrorism was central to the US security paradigm, and it is absolutely critical for a lot of other countries in terms of how they conduct their foreign policy, India included. We are now entering a stage where we are seeing the return to great power competition. As somebody who works a lot on counterterrorism, I think it is about time. but I also think that will make partnerships all the more important. But they will look different than they did during the last period of great power competition. During the Cold War, allies and partners, it was very much about choosing sides, especially in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. The main battlefields, as it were Europe and East and Southeast Asia. And from a US and Soviet Union perspective, the question was, are you aligned with me against my enemy? Not necessarily, what am I going to be getting from you on a day-to-day basis? It's quite different in terms of counterterrorism cooperation, which is ongoing. And I would note that when George W. Bush said after 9/11, you are either with us or you're with the terrorists, that no government other than the Taliban regime in Afghanistan stood up and said, well, we're going to side with Al-Qaeda. Everybody said we're going to side with the United States, the international community, against the terrorist threat. In reality, the record has been far more mixed, as David alluded to. And I just want to offer a couple of key points from the book, and then hopefully we can have a more fruitful discussion. The first overriding point is that I think we need to look at counterterrorism cooperation through two frames, whereas we tend to look at alliances that are more traditional through one frame. Now, one of the frames we need to use is the traditional alliance frame. What is the strength of the bilateral relationship? What is the nature of the bilateral relationship? What kind of incentives can one country offer to another to get it to do things it wants us to do? What are the different cooperative relationships in place in terms of, are they doing military training together? Is security assistance being provided? Things of this nature. And those types of instruments of statecraft, that bilateral relationship between two countries, those traditional alliance dynamics can be very, very important for getting what I would term tactical cooperation. Intelligence sharing and intelligence cooperation, the provision of access, be it for overflight or for supply lines or even for putting troops on the ground to do training, advising, and assisting, and in some cases also for drone strikes. The United States says legally they can conduct drone strikes anywhere, but from a policy perspective has historically sought permission from countries before it drops ordnance on their soil and on their populations. And that those traditional alliance dynamics are also somewhat helpful for what I would term regional cooperation, trying to get countries to participate in coalitions like the anti-ISIS coalition, trying to get them to participate in regional counterterrorism initiatives like the Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Partnership in the Sahel, those types of things. But then there's another frame that we need to look at, and that's a frame that comes from our understanding of civil wars. And this goes back to that book that I was originally going to write, which is the relationship between the terrorist group in question and the partner. And here I think this will come as no surprise to many people in this room, but it is sometimes a surprise to policymakers in other countries around the world, is that countries may have different types of relationships with terrorist groups. We tend to think in terms of shared threat. If you look at US policy statements, it talks all about shared threat, shared threat, shared threat, except it's not always enough just to share a threat. It's how those countries understand that threat and how they prioritize that threat relative to other threats. So yeah, the United States and Pakistan share a threat from Al-Qaeda, but Pakistan doesn't prioritize Al-Qaeda, prioritizes India and the TTP and Afghanistan. And it's more complicated because the United States has a strong strategic relationship with India. And so that complicates counterterrorism cooperation even against a shared threat. The final couple points I want to make before I wrap up is Chris was talking about CVE, and which is, I think, a dirty word in Washington, D.C. right now, although it remains an important one. And here I would simply point out that countries are much more apt to engage in sort of small-scale CVE-specific types of initiatives that target individuals or families or things like that than they are to get at the much bigger CVE relevant issues that we talk about, like governance reform, rule of law, socioeconomic reforms, things of that nature. We in the United States and also the international community are asking more of a lot of countries than we have in the past in terms of how they govern themselves, the nature of their polity. And these are areas where our objectives are butting up against elite values, right? Things that elites value. And it's very, very hard to move elites away from their interests. So let me conclude with this. 3 sort of summing up points. First, we tend to focus a lot on the mechanics of counterterrorism and counterterrorism cooperation and forget that we are trying to combat political violence. And counterterrorism is an inherently political activity. We cannot take politics out of it. That's number 1. Number 2, we tend to spend a lot more time trying to understand the threat than we do trying to understand the countries with which we're working. I think we very often don't have a great understanding of our partners. And that needs to change if we're going to get more out of one another. And then third, I come back to where I started. Partnerships are incredibly difficult. They are incredibly challenging. It is we have already heard it today. This is a time when, the president of my country thinks alliances aren't worth anything. Listen, alliances and partnerships are really difficult. The only thing worse than trying to operate without friends, allies, or partners, the only thing worse than trying to operate with problematic friends, allies, and partners is trying to operate without them entirely on your own.
Stephen, fantastic. So now, in fact, both are so interesting that I'm going to shut up and open it right to all of you in the room. This leaves us 10, 15 maximum minutes. So keep your interventions very short if I call on you, because we're here to hear from them primarily. There are microphones on each table. Helpful friends from ORF tell me. So if I recognize you, just pick up the microphone on your table and it should come to life. I saw a hand down there, sir. If you would identify yourself, use the microphone, and very briefly make a point or ask a question.
Sure. My name is Ramananda Sengupta. I'm the foreign editor of the New Indian Express and the Morning Standard, 2 newspapers out of India. My question is very simple. In Afghanistan, would the US be comfortable with the Taliban coming back to power? Because that's what seems to be happening right now. The question is free to either of you.
Great. Well, very interesting question. I hope you'll both answer it, actually. But why don't we start with Stephen?
The short answer is no, but the United States, or at the very least a considerable portion of the security establishment, including, it appears, the President of the United States, is also uncomfortable with the idea of staying in Afghanistan indefinitely. And despite the United States having been there for as long as it has been, the Taliban continues to make gains on the ground. And so from a US perspective, right, there are now, I think, healthy debates about whether, whether and for how long the United States should stay, what its ultimate objectives should be in the region. Now, that said, while I've been an advocate for debating these issues for some time, the process by which this has taken place is incredibly problematic. And it's not just Afghanistan, it's Syria as well. One of the great casualties of the Trump administration, and one that is not often sort of spoken about as much, I think, outside the Beltway, is the importance of process. Process is not sexy. Process doesn't normally get a lot of print, right, or media, but the process by which any government vets issues from an intelligence-led perspective, comes around the table to discuss these issues, and makes a coordinated decision that they can then implement so that everybody is singing off the same song sheet. That's not happening now. And so, no, the United States wouldn't be comfortable with having the Taliban in Afghanistan. The question is whether there's, what the United States can do to stop that at this point, and at what cost. I think those debates are healthy. I think the way in which it's playing out, as I said, incredibly problematic.
Great. Chris?
So this is one of those few times when I think I disagree with Stephen, because usually he and I were in violent agreement. So I just came back from Afghanistan, and I go to Afghanistan pretty regularly. And I actually don't think that this regime, and I'm saying regime deliberately, in Washington would be adverse to some kind of condominium with the Taliban. The Taliban have been consistently clear about what they want. They want to be a part of the power sharing arrangement without having to contest elections, right? They want to renegotiate the Afghan constitution, and they are very interested in reversing the gains that women have made. I mean, they certainly want to go back to basically Taliban 1.0 with respect to the position of women. And the Afghans themselves are very much opposed to this. And, I mean, Afghan civil society could not be more opposed. President Ghani himself could not be more opposed. But President Trump only cares about appeasing his most troglodytic, cave-dwelling base. And from their point of view, they view whether or not he has honored a commitment or not. It's a binary without nuance. And so when I was in Afghanistan, everyone I spoke to said Zalmay Khalilzad is here to basically tie a bow with the Taliban. Everyone knew that Zalmay Khalilzad was coming to Afghanistan to basically disrupt the elections. And part of this is because the Taliban don't want these elections. So I agree with everything that Stephen said about process. I mean, basically, President Trump, I don't like to use president and Trump without a very large space between those two words. Policy changes on his tweet. You know, let's take a look at what he did in Pakistan. He basically woke up one day. In this case, I happen to agree with him. He decided that Pakistan was the, Sabse Bade Shaitan, and he decided that all aid would be cut off. And what his regime did was that it basically goosed up behind him and found a way of, in fact, making that a reality. But we've also seen when President Trump wakes up after having too much ice cream and too many Big Macs, that he says things that his regime disagrees with. And, for example, the Syria policy is a very good example. The problem with Afghanistan is that I would say, there is not a consensus opinion, right? Everyone sort of understands that there's no winning in Afghanistan, right? If we couldn't, and the height of the surge, we never had enough to defeat the Taliban, at the height of the surge. So we're certainly not going to be in that position now. So, and President Trump, more than anything, cares about what his base thinks, right? And so I would not write off a condominium with the Taliban. And let's also be very clear that President Trump has not looked at a map with any significant understanding. If you were going to have a different outcome in Afghanistan, you need to kick the crap out of Pakistan, right? But you cannot also kick the crap out of Iran. And at the end of the Obama administration, we had the JCPOA, right? We had the possibility of running logistics through Iran. India is a very important partner for this. But what we've seen with the Trump administration is that they're basically ruining all of these relationships to the point of non-functionality. And so at the end of the day, when you come to a very crude electoral calculus, what does Trump want? Trump wants the facade of winning. And if it means, as my mother would say from Indiana, putting chocolate on a turd and calling it a donut, he is perfectly willing to do that.
I would just briefly, just to clarify,
He
so
doesn't like donuts.
I love donuts. I don't think you and I are as far apart. My understanding of comfortable with them coming back to power would not be as part of a power sharing agreement, but of the Taliban running Afghanistan. And I don't think that the United States would be comfortable with that. But I also would add, I think the United States may be at a point, especially because of President Trump, where they may not be comfortable with it, but they also may decide we have been here long enough and we are going to roll the dice on what happens next. So.
Great. Now, I'm afraid those were wonderful answers and in depth. The result is we're out of time. So I'm going to encourage all of you to grab the authors separately during the meeting, buy their books. They're clearly very interesting books. And I'm going to thank them both on your behalf. Let's give them a big hand.